They say the worst betrayals wear familiar faces. Larry never expected his own daughter to change the locks while he was in a hospital bed, papering it over with a claim that his home was abandoned and unsafe. But when the city sent an inspector to sign off on the condemnation, the man who showed up carried a clipboard, a hard hat, and a memory 40 years older than both. He was the soldier who dragged Larry through the mud of a jungle in '71, and he hadn't forgotten. Larry, a 74-year-old Vietnam veteran, returned from the hospital to find his daughter had locked him out and declared his home abandoned. The city sent Code Inspector Paul to verify the claim. Paul froze when he saw the name. He'd carried that man through a firefight in 1971. The scheme was about to collide with the one person who owed Larry his life. To understand why that reunion mattered beyond anything either man could have predicted, you have to go back to a jungle in Quang Tri Province, 1971. Larry was 22 years old, a rifleman with the 101st Airborne, pinned down in elephant grass so tall it closed over his head. The firefight had been rolling for 3 hours when a round caught him high in the chest, just below the collarbone, and every instinct told him he was finished. He couldn't walk. He couldn't drag himself. The only reason he took another breath was the medic who appeared out of the smoke, a kid from Ohio named Paul, who grabbed Larry by the webbing of his flak jacket and pulled. 400 meters under fire, Paul never let go. They tumbled into a helicopter together, covered in the same mud and the same blood, and then the chaos of triage separated them. Larry woke up in a hospital in Saigon. Paul's name wasn't on any list. For 50 years, Larry carried two things home from that war: a piece of shrapnel the surgeons left in his shoulder, and the name of the man who refused to leave him behind. He looked for Paul once, back in the '80s, but the trail went cold. He moved on. He built a life. 30 years at the mill, a house on Oakwood Avenue with a front porch he rebuilt himself, a wife named Evelyn who died too young, and a daughter named Michelle who he loved without reservation, even when she made it difficult. Evelyn used to say their daughter had a gift for finding the shortest path to what she wanted and never checking who was paying the toll. Larry dismissed it as mother-daughter friction. He always did see the best in people, and that blindness, that stubborn decency, was the door his daughter would eventually walk through. The trigger was a hospital stay, a minor stroke, the doctors called it, the kind that announces itself and then retreats, but demands weeks of monitoring and rehab. Larry was 68 days on the 4th floor of Mercy General, staring out a window and counting ceiling tiles, while Michelle cleaned out his pantry and told the neighbors she was just looking after things. What she was actually looking after was a plan. She contacted a locksmith, told him her father had passed, and she needed to secure the property. Then she filed a formal complaint with the City Code Enforcement Office. The home was abandoned, the owner deceased or incapacitated, the structure deteriorating and attracting squatters. She requested an emergency inspection and a condemnation order that would allow the property to be sold at auction, with the proceeds, naturally, routed to the next of kin. The paperwork was clean. The city opened a case. Larry was discharged on a Tuesday. He took a cab home, stood on his own porch, and slid his key into a lock that didn't turn. He tried the back door, same thing. He peered through the front window and saw his furniture, his photographs, his whole life sitting on the other side of the glass like a museum exhibit he was no longer admitted to. That was the moment he understood his daughter had done something he couldn't fix with a phone call. The city inspector assigned to verify the abandonment claim was a 76-year-old man named Paul, who had left combat behind 50 years ago but never stopped carrying the weight of the men he couldn't save. He went through his case files every morning with the quiet efficiency of a man who had long ago stopped expecting surprises. That Thursday, he picked up the Oakwood Avenue file, glanced at the homeowner's name, and froze. His hand actually trembled. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud since the interior of a Huey helicopter over Quang Tri Province. He closed the file, sat down heavily, and spent a full minute staring at the wall. Then he put on his hard hat, grabbed his clipboard, and drove to the address. He had to know if the man he dragged out of that field had made it. Larry was sitting on his front steps, still holding the useless key, when the city truck pulled up to the curb. The inspector stepped out, a tall man with silver hair and a careful walk. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. 50 years collapsed into a single heartbeat on a quiet street that had no idea it was hosting a resurrection. Paul stepped onto the curb and said a name that had not crossed his lips in 50 years. Larry, just the name, spoken like a man testing whether the ground would hold. Larry's hand closed around the key so hard the metal bit into his palm. He didn't understand what he was hearing at first, because you don't expect the ghost of the best moment of your worst year to show up in a reflective vest and city-issued boots holding a clipboard. But Paul said it again, and this time his voice cracked, and Larry knew. He knew because you never forget the sound of the man who dragged you out of hell. The two men stood on that porch like bookends of a war neither had ever really left, and for a full minute no one could speak past the weight of what had just landed between them. Then Paul cleared his throat, professional reflex reasserting itself, and said the words that would turn Larry's confusion into ice. "Mr. Callahan, I'm here in response to a verified complaint that this property is abandoned and unsafe." The complaint was filed by a family member who claims the owner is deceased or incapacitated. I'm supposed to inspect, document the condition, and recommend whether the city should proceed with condemnation and auction. He paused, looking at Larry, at the key, at the anger and heartbreak and exhaustion etched into the old man's face. "I think I can save us both some paperwork. This house is not abandoned. It is occupied by its legal owner, who is standing right in front of me. And the family member who filed that complaint, I'm going to guess, is named Michelle." Larry's jaw tightened. "You know her too?" "No," Paul said, "but I've seen this before, and I need you to understand something very clearly. The people who do this, they plan it. They count on the system being slow and stacked in their favor. A false abandonment claim isn't a prank. It's a financial weapon. Michelle didn't just change the locks. She registered the property as vacant on the city's blight list. That triggers a cascade. The city sends an inspector. If the inspector signs off on the complaint, the property enters condemnation proceedings, and the owner gets a notice delivered to a mailbox they can't access. Most people don't find out until the auction notice is already published, and by then it's nearly impossible to stop. She almost got away with it, but not quite, because the city sent you, Larry said. "The city sent me," Paul agreed, "and I can file a report that kills the condemnation right now. But that only solves today. Michelle can file again. She can challenge my report. She can produce false evidence, witnesses, statements from neighbors, even claim you're mentally unfit. And if she does, you'll need legal representation that most retired steelworkers can't afford." Unless, Paul said, a certain veteran gets connected to the right legal aid clinic before she realizes her scheme has been blown. He pulled a card from his pocket. It wasn't part of the inspection protocol. He'd carried it for years, just in case. Larry took the card, reading the words Veterans Legal Support Project aloud, and his hands started to shake. He wasn't thinking about the house anymore. He was thinking about the fact that a man he'd searched for across 5 decades had just saved him twice, on 2 separate battlefields, in 2 entirely different kinds of jungle. He looked up, and the question finally came out. "How did you find me, Paul?" "I didn't," Paul said. "You found me. The name on the case file, I saw it this morning, and I almost called in sick. I wasn't sure I could handle seeing what the years had done to you. And I wasn't sure I could handle finding out that you hadn't made it after all, that I dragged you 400 meters for nothing." Larry's eyes were wet now, but he wasn't the kind of man who apologized for it. "You want to know what the years have done?" he said, gesturing at the locked door behind him. "They've given me a daughter who tried to steal my house while I was recovering from a stroke. That's what they've done." Paul nodded slowly. "Then I guess we've got work to do." He walked back to his city truck, retrieved a clipboard and a pen, and began writing notes on the inspection form, notes that would become an official record spelling out that the property at 1117 Oakwood Avenue was structurally sound, legally occupied, and had been targeted by a fraudulent complaint. He didn't use the word fraudulent that would open him up to pushback, but he made it clear. So clear that any supervisor reading it would immediately close the case. But here's the thing about a scheme that's been months in the making. When the person behind it realizes the wheels are coming off, they don't just walk away. They panic. And panicked people do dangerous things. Michelle had been watching the house. She saw the city truck, saw the 2 men talking, and her first instinct wasn't shame or remorse. It was calculation. She dialed a number, spoke for less than a minute, and then got in her car. By the time Paul finished his report, a second vehicle was pulling up on the opposite side of the street. A locksmith. The same one she'd used 6 weeks earlier, returning now at her request to confirm, on the record, that he had been told the owner was deceased and that the daughter was the rightful administrator of the estate. She was building a paper trail, hopping to bury Paul's report under conflicting documentation, before the city had time to process either. Paul saw the van, recognized the logo, and understood instantly that this was no longer just a heartwarming reunion. It was a race. He needed to get his report filed before Michelle could muddy the waters, and he needed Larry to have legal standing before the next business day. He told Larry to stay on the porch. Then he walked directly toward the locksmith's van, clipboard still in hand, and introduced himself as the city code inspector assigned to the case. The locksmith, a man who had no idea he'd been used as a tool in a fraud scheme, started talking, and Paul started writing. Meanwhile, Larry, still holding that useless key, looked up at his own window and saw a light flick on inside. Someone was in the house. Michelle hadn't just changed the locks. She had let herself in while he was sitting on the porch, entering through the back, using her own key. She was retrieving documents, personal files. The kind of information you need when you plan to claim in court that your father is incompetent and that you are the only one capable of managing his affairs. Larry pounded on the door, but she didn't answer. He called her name, and the only reply was the sound of a drawer slamming shut. This is what real betrayal looks like, not a dramatic confrontation, but the quiet ransacking of a life from inside your own home while you watch from the porch like a stranger. Paul had been right. She had a plan, and she was already executing the next stage of it. The reunion that had just given Larry back the best man from his past was about to collide with the worst person from his present, and only one of them was willing to break the law to win. Michelle heard the pounding on the door and moved faster. In the kitchen drawer, she found the folder she'd planted 2 weeks before, a collection of bank statements and unpaid bills she'd deliberately withheld from her father's mail, arranged to look like evidence of financial incompetence. She snapped photos with her phone, documenting what she'd later call the condition of a neglected home. She knew Paul was outside. She knew he was talking to the locksmith. What she didn't know was that the locksmith, a man named Danny who had run a small local business for 18 years, was already telling Paul everything. Yes, she told me the owner was deceased. Yes, she paid cash. Yes, I asked for a death certificate, and she said it was still being processed. I didn't think twice. Paul wrote down every word, time-stamped the statement, and had Danny sign it right there on the hood of the city truck. Then Paul turned toward the house and saw Larry frozen on the porch, his face a mask of helpless fury as he watched his own daughter move through his living room like she already owned it. Paul walked up the steps, put a hand on Larry's shoulder, and said 5 words that were not part of any city protocol. I'm going in after her. He had no legal authority to enter a locked residence without permission. He knew that. But he also knew that Michelle was inside destroying or fabricating evidence while he stood on the porch, and a man who once sprinted through gunfire to save a life was not about to let procedural niceties hand a house over to a fraudster. He used the locksmith's key. Michelle spun around when she heard the door open. She was standing in the hallway, clutching a manila folder, and for a split second her face registered genuine shock before it hardened into something rehearsed. "Who are you?" she demanded, though she already knew. "I'm the city inspector your complaint summoned," Paul said evenly, "and I'm here to tell you that this property is not abandoned. The owner is alive, competent, and standing on his own porch. The complaint you filed is false. You are currently trespassing, and I am documenting everything I see." She didn't flinch. "That's not what my documentation will show," she said, tapping the folder. "And I have witnesses who will confirm my father hasn't lived here in months." She walked past him, out the front door, and didn't look at Larry. Not once. What happened next unfolded over the following 48 hours, and every single hour brought a new escalation. Michelle went directly to the county recorder's office. She had a document that had been quietly prepared while Larry was in the hospital, a quitclaim deed transferring the property to her, with a signature that looked enough like his to pass a cursory glance. She presented it for recording, along with a notarized affidavit stating she was the acting administrator of an abandoned estate. The clerk, who had no reason to suspect fraud, stamped it received and placed it in the queue for processing the next business day. If that deed entered the public record, Larry's house would legally belong to his daughter, and reversing it would take months of litigation and tens of thousands of dollars he didn't have. Paul discovered this at 4:58 p.m., 12 minutes after the recorder's office closed for the weekend. He called Larry with the news, and for the first time in 50 years, Larry heard the same voice that had said, "Stay with me, soldiers," say something else. "I'm not going to let this happen. Get in the truck. We're going to the courthouse." There's a thing about veterans' legal aid clinics that most civilians don't understand. They don't just offer advice, they mobilize. When Paul called the Veterans Legal Support Project from the parking lot of the county courthouse, he didn't get a voicemail. He got Margaret, a 63-year-old attorney who had spent 3 decades fighting housing cases and whose husband had served in the same division as Paul. She listened for exactly 4 minutes, asked 3 questions, and then said 3 words, "I'll be there." By 7 p.m., Margaret was standing in front of a night duty judge with an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order and a lis pendens, a legal notice that would freeze the title and prevent any transfer until the fraud allegations could be heard. She had Paul's inspection report, the locksmith's sworn statement, Larry's hospital discharge papers showing he was the legal occupant, and a photograph of Michelle removing documents from the house that Paul had snapped on his phone. The judge reviewed the stack, looked up, and granted the order at 7:22 p.m. The deed recording was blocked before it could go live. Michelle's scheme had just hit a wall, and she didn't even know it yet. But the legal victory, as decisive as it was, solved only the immediate crisis. The deeper damage had been done. Larry sat on a bench outside the courthouse as the evening cooled, Paul beside him, and finally let himself feel the full weight of what his daughter had tried to do. She didn't just want the house, he said quietly. She wanted to erase me, wipe me out like I was already gone. Paul didn't answer with platitudes. He answered with the truth he'd carried for 50 years. When I got home from the war, he said, I couldn't stop thinking about the ones I left behind, the ones I couldn't reach. I had your name on a list of wounded I tried to find, but the records were a mess. I figured you'd died in transport. I figured I'd failed you. I spent half a century not knowing. Larry turned to look at him, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Then Larry said, You didn't fail me, Paul. You're the reason I had a life to come home to. You gave me 50 years. And now you've given me my house back. I'd say we're even, but I don't think even covers it. That moment on the bench, 2 old men in the parking lot of a courthouse, was the real turning point. It was where the story stopped being about a fraudulent deed and started being about something much larger. The debt that combat creates, the bonds that time cannot dissolve, and the way the universe sometimes arranges for the right person to show up at exactly the right moment, not once, but twice. But the story wasn't over. Michelle had been blocked, not defeated. She still had her folder, her forged documents, and a desperate willingness to burn everything down rather than admit what she'd done. And in the coming days, she would make one final move, one last attempt to turn the system against her father that would force a reckoning no one saw coming. Michelle's final move came on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after the lis pendens froze the title. She walked into the county probate court and filed an emergency petition for temporary guardianship of her father, alleging he was mentally incompetent, medically fragile, and incapable of managing his own affairs. The petition was thick. She had the hospital records showing the stroke, the bank statements she'd withheld, the photographs she'd taken inside the house, and a statement from a neighbor who had been told Larry was moving into assisted living. The petition asked the court to immediately seize control of all of Larry's assets and appoint Michelle as sole guardian with full power to sell the property. She filed at 8:30 a.m., and by 10, a process server was on Oakwood Avenue with a summons for Larry to appear at an emergency hearing the following afternoon. The speed was intentional. She wanted to overwhelm him before he could mount a defense. What she didn't know was that Larry had already been connected to Margaret, who had been anticipating exactly this kind of flanking maneuver. Margaret received the petition by email at 10:15, read it in 11 minutes, and placed 3 calls. The first was to Paul, asking him to bring his full inspection report and the locksmith's sworn statement to her office. The second was to Mercy General, requesting Larry's discharge evaluation, which explicitly stated he was cognitively intact and capable of independent living. The third was to the court clerk, notifying them that she would be entering a counter-motion to dismiss with prejudice and filing a formal complaint of elder financial abuse with the district attorney's office. At the hearing, Michelle arrived in a dark suit with an attorney who specialized in contested guardianships. She played the role of the concerned daughter perfectly, her voice soft, her eyes welling at the right moments. She told the judge her father had been deteriorating for months, that he'd stopped paying bills, that he'd locked himself out of his own home because he couldn't remember where he'd put his keys. She presented the photographs of what she called the condition of neglect. She said she only wanted to protect him. The judge listened carefully, nodded at the appropriate moments, and then asked to hear from the other side. Margaret stood and laid out the counter-narrative in a methodical sequence that left no room for doubt. The locksmith, Danny, testified that Michelle had told him the owner was deceased. Paul, in full city inspector uniform, testified that he had found Larry on the porch, clearly alive and oriented, and that the house was in perfectly habitable condition. The hospital discharge papers were entered into evidence, showing Larry's cognitive function was unimpaired. And then came the piece of evidence that broke Michelle's story clean in half. A time-stamped photograph from Paul's phone showing Michelle inside the locked house, removing a folder of documents while Larry sat on the porch outside. Margaret asked, "If your father was so confused that he couldn't manage his own affairs, why did you have to wait until he was locked out and sitting on the porch to go inside and retrieve those documents?" Michelle's answer was a long silence followed by an unconvincing claim that she was simply organizing his files. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had presided over more elder abuse cases than she could count, had seen enough. She dismissed the emergency petition with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. She issued a formal finding that Michelle had submitted false statements to the court, and she referred the entire matter to the district attorney for investigation into elder financial abuse, fraud, and attempted theft by deception. Michelle stood up, her composure finally cracking, and tried to say something about this being a misunderstanding. The judge cut her off. "A misunderstanding is misplacing your keys. What happened here was a systematic attempt to steal your father's home. You should be grateful he's only taking back his house and not pressing for your incarceration." Larry sat through the entire hearing without saying a word. When it was over, he walked out of the courthouse, past the reporters who had somehow gotten wind of the story and got into Paul's city truck. The two men drove back to Oakwood Avenue in silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of everything that doesn't need to be said. When they pulled up to the house, Larry noticed something new. The locks had been changed again, this time by a locksmith Paul had arranged, and a single new key sat on the porch railing in a small envelope with Larry's name on it. Inside was a note from Danny, the original locksmith, apologizing for his part in the scheme and offering his testimony free of charge if Larry ever needed it. Larry put the key in the lock, turned it, and the door swung open to his own living room, his own photographs, his own life. He walked inside, Paul following a step behind, and the first thing he did was go to the mantelpiece and pick up a framed photograph of his wife Evelyn. He stood there holding it for a full minute, and when he spoke, his voice was steady but barely above a whisper. "I brought him home, Ev. I brought him home after all this time." Paul settled into a chair that had been empty for 50 years, and the two men began the conversation that the war had interrupted. They talked about Quang Tri. They talked about the medic who'd worked on Larry in the helicopter, a kid named Rodriguez who Paul had known from basic training and who had died in a car accident in 1976. They talked about Larry's years at the mill, about Paul's decision to become a code inspector because he still needed to feel useful, still needed to walk into broken situations and make them right. And then Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out something he'd been carrying for 2 decades, waiting for a moment he'd stopped believing would ever come. A small metal object, tarnished and bent, one half of a dog tag. The other half, he said, "I left with you. I figured if you woke up and I wasn't there, you'd at least have my name." Larry stared at it and then slowly unbuttoned the top of his shirt and pulled out a chain he'd worn since 1971. On it hung the matching half of Paul's dog tag, the metal worn smooth from decades of being held, rubbed, remembered. He'd never taken it off. Not in the hospital, not in the courtroom, not ever. "You told me to hold on to it until you came back," Larry said, "so I did." The two men looked at each other, and for the first time in 50 years, the debt between them was finally, completely, and forever settled. Larry and Paul spent the rest of that afternoon on the porch, two old soldiers in mismatched chairs, talking about nothing and everything. The house on Oakwood Avenue, which had nearly been stolen out from under its owner by the person who should have protected him most, was quiet again. Not the quiet of abandonment, but the quiet of something restored. Michelle was never prosecuted. Larry refused to press charges, not because she deserved mercy, but because he knew that sitting in a courtroom for months would cost him something more valuable than retribution. He chose his peace over her punishment. The district attorney's office opened an investigation anyway, and her name now sits in a file that will follow her into any future attempt to manage someone else's finances. She lost the house. She lost her father. She lost the battle she started, and the world kept turning without her. Paul retired from the city 6 months later, and he and Larry bought a small fishing boat they take out on the lake every Thursday. They still wear their dog tags, two halves of the same whole, reunited after half a century. The neighbors say you can hear them laughing on the porch some evenings, telling stories they've told 100 times, each retelling a little more imperfect and a little more true. Some betrayals come from the people you trust most, and some rescues come from the people who never stopped carrying your name. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe. The stories that matter most are the ones we share, and we're just getting started. Thank you for being here.